first thing, and this is really, really hard in any role, but certainly in like a sales role, is listen and learn before you give opinions, right? You don't know, right? You do not know the answer day one. You do not know the answer week one. The answers that you ultimately will give, 9 times out of 10 will be dumb. That won't actually.
All right, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the RevAmp podcast. I'm joined by Mike today, who is the head of global sales at EverStage. And we're going to talk all about kind of his experience as a sales leader. But before we dive into that, Mike, why don't you introduce yourself to the folks at home and give us a little background?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Mike Groeneveld. I totally understand why you didn't want to take a crack at pronouncing that last name. It's
I
not the
gave up
easiest
after
one.
the third try.
Yeah, it's Mike. Yeah, I'm good with it, man. No, so I'm like a lifelong sales person, right? So my current role, I'm the VP of global sales at a company called EverStage. But I started my career in med software, right? And so it was at a company where it was back when doctors' offices were still using paper versus electronic health records. And I was kind of on that wave of trying to get people and get doctors to go digital. So I started in that sort of capacity. And then, I did my BDR role. I moved into a sales rep role. And then that led me to a company called Bright Edge, which is an SEO platform. And I was an AE there. And then that's how I kind of moved into sales leadership. And then, throughout my career, I've managed sales teams for anywhere from 0 million in revenue to over 100 million in revenue. And I've seen kind of all the good, the bad, the recessions, the knots. And I've learned a lot along the way, both positively and negatively, and excited to share my learnings.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a good place to start, because you do have this really kind of interesting background, a lot of experience, starting. A lot of us, even in myself as a marketer, I started in sales. We all kind of start somewhere around there. But you moved from kind of a very not technical world into where you're at today. And so throughout that time, things have changed, right? We were chugging along. 2020 came, the whole world turned upside down. For a while, it kind of seemed like, I don't know, maybe everyone's going to go bankrupt. But then, the interest rates went down, money kind of, and it had this kind of weird effect with it, especially in the SaaS space, where many companies actually did extraordinarily well because there was more budget, people were working from home, and they needed more tools, things like that. And obviously, in the last year and change, we've kind of gone to the other extreme in a lot of ways, right? And so that's caused a lot of choppiness, and some companies kind of didn't make it. Some have, excelled. Some have been found ways to kind of be flexible and adapt to a changing market. But I mean, from your perspective, just throughout the time, what has that experience been like as a sales leader, kind of seeing those changes happen? Were you able to kind of tell they were coming, or was it kind of all of a sudden? And what is the process of kind of saying, okay, well, something's changing now, we have to kind of take stock of how we go forward?
Yeah. So I saw COVID coming a mile away.
Yeah.
No, I definitely will touch on kind of how COVID changed things. But I actually, when you ask that question, it kind of brings me back to more of like, demand generation and pipeline generation, right? Like, as I mentioned, like I think many of us in sales, I started off my career as a BDR, and it used to be just hardcore quantity, hitting the phones, hitting the pavement, and volume work ethic got you where you needed to go. And certainly, as the times have changed, I think as a sales leader, I constantly have to ask myself, am I selling how my prospects want to buy, or am I selling based off of how I want to sell? And I think at root, that really comes from, just, the microcosm of that is like, just pipeline generation. So, obviously today it's all about intent and demand, and how do you, kind of start by creating the intent and then capture that intent at the right time when your prospect is ready to actually take a demo. And not everybody's ready to hit your website and they want a demo right then and there. So there's a lot of learnings and a lot of kind of continued growth, I think even today, about one, how you need to think about pipeline generation and how that's not even really just a sales function, and that's a marketing function. And how, from my perspective, how the whole ecosystem of us as an organization really think about everything that we do when it comes to sales, right? And pipeline is the first one that comes to my head about that's been so different, right? I've had to bring in really great leaders that run our BDR teams, because I can't just pull from my experience today, right? What worked for me is not what works today, right? So I've had to learn quite a bit and continue to have to learn and evolve there. But from a COVID perspective, I think, again, like the one thing that I think a lot of sales folks and sales leaders, rightly so, believe down in their core is that they're in control of literally every outcome that is put in front of them, right? I am a big, believer of extreme ownership, right? And that concept is like, I have a number I need to hit. It doesn't matter what any of the circumstances are. I need to hit that number, right? Or as a leader, I need my team to perform regardless of what disease has flooded the world, right? But I think what you end up kind of realizing as you continue to grow, and certainly what COVID kind of brought, is that you got to really make sure that you're with a company that has product market fit, and you're really with a company that is hardcore solving a real need and a real pain. You can be the best salesperson in the world, and COVID kind of, exposed this. You can be the best salesperson in the world, but if somebody I was just interviewing somebody, so this is top of mind. They used to work at a company, Expedia, and they got laid off during COVID because nobody traveled anymore, right? So, I think one, it's like, there's certainly some realities to that where you could do everything right, and if everything else related to your product and your company isn't really delivering the right sort of value, that it might be time to kind of make a switch, right? So one, I certainly think there's an element of COVID that happened, right? And that exposed a lot of organizations, not necessarily people, right? But I think as I think about that now, I've certainly been in leadership, positions where, again, marketing really wasn't, good, products not great. Nobody's really making money from a sales perspective, so hiring is a pain, and nothing was really kind of working. And I stepped into that role thinking, hey, right, I'm going to be able to figure this out. And it really takes more than just you, right? As selfishly as you think you have to be as a sales leader, you really have to collaborate, and you really have to think about how you're selling, how you're generating pipeline, how you're positioning your whole customer journey post-contract signing, in relation to all these other departments, right? And as you grow in leadership, you almost have to be the glue versus the expert in the craft, right? So I think that's how I've seen it grow. That's how I've seen it evolve. And I think certainly that's how you're going to be successful, is making sure that, each department in your organization is really working in conjunction with each other, and that you're not, you understand you all have a common goal, common good, and how can you really live that yourself, so everybody else feels that way as well.
And that kind of philosophy, the extreme ownership, how was that? How did you develop that? Was that something that was an early role or a mentor you had that kind of that was their philosophy and you took it on, or was it something that's kind of grown over time?
So I think it was something my old boss, Michael Sundaresan, shout out Michael. He made all of our leaders at a company I was at called Bright Edge. He made all of our sales leaders read the book and then write their 3 best things, like writing a book report, which I'm sure, sales leaders will to have that project thrown at our plate. But it really kind of helped, for me, it helped kind of put a language to how I already kind of naturally felt, right? It wasn't anything like earth shattering to me. I think I was already kind of living like that. So I kind of will explain the background of that and why, but shout out to Michael for allowing me to be able to explain this to other people. And Also shout out to Jocko Willink because it's his book. But so ultimately, like I grew up super poor, right? Like if I wanted to get new shoes on the first day of school, I had to go pressure wash driveways. I lived in Florida, so they go pressure wash driveways for it. And I've seen and I've had to live that nothing's handed to you, right? Like literally nothing, right? So I felt some really, really low lows. And then I realized that like, hey, nobody cares, right? You know, the world's going to move on, right? And so it's either you do something about it and you don't make yourself the victim, or you fade, right? Or you just live a miserable existence, you know? So that at its root is kind of what that concept is about. And I was kind of forced to have to do that, or else I was just going to live a miserable life. And then reading that book and being able to then, you know, kind of give some hardcore examples about how others can do it has really kind of changed the game for me.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of that philosophy, a big fan of him. But you know, it's off, you know, one would think that the concept of like taking ownership and you know, your kind of responsibility, things like that are, you know, just obvious, but there, you know, it might clash with certain kind of, let's say, generationally might be a challenge, especially when with the name extreme ownership. Have you had a challenge kind of building the culture around that as you grow the team?
So you bring up generationally.
I was tiptoeing around it. I didn't know quite how
Yeah,
to
you're doing a good job, man. You're doing a good job there. No, but I think it's very real, right? So how I get around that and how I navigate that whole concept is first off, I'm a hardcore expectation setter. And I also lead from and just live in a very real and vulnerable way, right? So number one, I'm not you're if you want to join an organization and be around me, I'm gonna shoot it straight and I'm gonna live by extreme ownership. I'm happy to kind of, you know, teach it to you and guide you through it. But the expectation is that if you're gonna join an organization that I'm a part of, that you're gonna have to, you know, embrace that as well. And I preface that that's not for everybody. You know what I mean? You know, I think where I've really kind of thrived is not at organizations that I step into that are already gigantic. It's really on the climb up is really kind of where I've made my mark. And so naturally, there's going to be things that are wrong and that you think the company should have that they don't, and situations where, you know, things are outside of your control that are detriments to you, and the how you handle that with an ability of like, I need to figure this out and it's on me to figure this out. If you start there, everything kind of figures itself out, right? So one, I make no bones about what sort of, you know, culture that you're walking into. But two, I also am very, very detailed with setting expectations. So like, what does that actually mean in a day-to-day, right? And I'll give you an example. You know, there's no us rescheduling meetings, right? For anything that we do, right? We're in control. We have to be prepared. This is our job. Like, there's no excuse, right? Like if meeting holds, if our prospect's willing to show up, we are willing to be prepared for it, right? Period. So set the expectation. It's not going to be like, hey, you know, I need to go to the doctors, right? You schedule around that, you know what I mean? So that's kind of one. You know, another is like, if I give you a task, my expectation is you complete that task in a timely manner that doesn't sacrifice quality. And obviously, you know, I'm not trying to like have you, you know, rush to do something and, not finish one project before you have to work to another. But my expectation is that you answer promptly, right? Especially in a remote world, you answer promptly when you can, and that a task gets completed within a timely manner. And if not, then you let me know why and when I can accept it, right? So little things like that, I think getting those out really, really early is really the root of the whole generational problem, right? Where people will think that there's an issue that if we would have just gotten ahead of that prior to it happening, you realize it's not as big of a deal as it might seem. But not doing that can really like dive you down a rabbit hole to where, you know, it becomes a way bigger issue than it ever needed to be if we would have just set the right expectations at the beginning. So being real, being vulnerable, letting people know that like when I mess up, and then 3, setting the right expectations.
Yeah, I love that. And I've come to appreciate being honest upfront and forward with expectations ahead. It may feel uncomfortable for some people at first, but it you know, gets over a whole bunch of discomfort that'll happen later if you don't do.
Yeah, and also I think a point of that too is like, you know, when I roll out, so like, you know, whenever I have a new hire that comes on, I go through this, you know, this list of expectations, and the expectation explanation, every single thing has to have a why, right? So I'm saying my expectation is this, and the why is, right? And it does not make the list if I don't have that why, right? But I also need to explain you that why so you can ultimately, you know, be comfortable with it. And I also always preface that you don't have to be comfortable with it right away either, right? The biggest thing is to be open with me about why you're not feeling the way. This is extreme ownership as well, right? The biggest thing is to create a culture to where your people can feel open with like, hey, I don't agree with that. Here's why I don't agree with that. So we can ultimately come to terms on how we get there. And maybe it means I need to adapt a little bit, right? I'm not naive to that. So I think when you're setting those expectations, when you explain the why, it becomes a little bit less of a, you know, I'm telling you this versus this is why we're doing this.
Yeah, I love that. And so a bit of a kind of departure from the culture conversation. And you had mentioned that, you know, you kind of thrive, or it's your sweet spot is coming into a company that's kind of at product market fit on the way up and kind of helping to like feed the fire and really get the engine going. You know, I've been thinking about this a lot because it's very clear to me that, and I'm very grateful that the company I'm in today does have product market fit. And I've worked at very early stage companies that we were like, maybe we do, maybe we don't. It was very clear to me in retrospect that it wasn't the case. But it's, you know, how does, especially from the outside, if you're looking at a new role, kind of what you were, you know, where your sweet spot is in that place, how can you really know, you know, or what are the things that you can like look at to kind of understand that?
It's a really good question, right? So, one, I think the biggest thing that I would suggest, and I proactively do it for folks that I hire, is I send them phone calls of like real life scenarios. Not all close won deals, some close lost deals, some that are still in the pipeline, right? I want you to feel how this actually goes, right? And there's a lot of benefits to doing that. One, they get the right expectation of what they're walking into, but 2, you can also get a feel for what was their feedback after hearing it, and you know, you get a kind of a sense of how they think about things from a sales perspective. But that's also how I did it too. But I also think that you know, it's a very easy when you're in the seat and you're at the company to like understand those things and understand that you have product market fit and really what the competitors are and whatnot. But really, you have to think about how you do that proactively without being in the seat. So the reality is how you actually understand that is one, like look at the G2 reviews, right? Understand how many are there in the space? How many reviews do they have? What is the feedback that they get? How does that relate to the company that you're looking at, right? Another one, and this, you know, this sounds a little bit naive. This sounds kind of a little bit weird, rather, is reach out to customers, right? Reach out to that company's customers and ask how they feel about the product, right? Reach out to a sales rep at the company or whatever role that you're getting into. Reach out to somebody there ad hoc and just say, hey, I'd love to pick your brain, right? It's another thing that I do proactively when I hire folks. Have them speak with the team, right? Like, get a sense. You're going to be, what's this culture all about, right? You know, and so they'll give you the answers for sure because they're living it, right? If you try to do that research by just like hardcore not interacting with people, right? Like just looking at, you know, articles and press releases and things of that nature, like you're probably not going to know the full depth of it. So I would certainly suggest like starting there so you get a kind of a sense of what questions to even ask, but then actually like dig in with the reality, dig in with people I think as a microcosm, I'm just a big fan of that in general, even when you need to learn something, period, to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question, probably outside the scope of this conversation, but one I think about a lot, because it's like, it's not necessarily there's like some magical formula where you input the numbers,
100%.
is there product market fit here or not? It's kind of like just a vibe, which is, kind of not a great way to measure things, but it's, it's clear to me now kind of what the situation I'm in today is one where there is product market fit, and I look back at previous ones and there wasn't. But kind of on continuing on that idea of coming into a company that's kind of on an upward trajectory, having found product market fit and really kind of taking it to the next stage. And this is like a pretty big question, so maybe we could take it in pieces, but like, what's the playbook? I mean, what is kind of, how does one do that? Like, if you're expected to take things to a different level than they are, what is that? What's the playbook?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, and this is really, really hard in any role, but certainly in like a sales role, is listen and learn before you give opinions, right? You don't know, right? You do not know the answer day one. You do not know the answer week one. The answers that you ultimately will give, 9 times out of 10 will be dumb. That won't actually be the answer that you think, a month from now, right? So number one is like, be comfortable outside of what your normal probably habits are, where it's like, you ask me a question, I want to give you an opinion, and you want to drive value naturally, right? But you actually really have to think like, I need to absorb here, right? I need to listen and learn. One of my former colleagues joined an organization where they gave that individual 9 months of listening and learning, and he was in a leadership role. 9 months. And I was like, holy shit. Like, I was hardcore making like business changing decisions at 9 months, right? So but I certainly think, first week or two at least, really go out of your way to not give opinions and really just try to learn, right? So I think that's number one. Number two, and this is a lot easier in today's day and age, but you have to like really get your hands dirty in whatever your ultimately responsibilities are going to be, right? So I'll give you an example for me. So we're lucky at EverStage that obviously, and it's just today's day and age, I think most organizations will use some call recording, tools, right? So we use Gong. So I could go and I could literally just spend hours and hours catching up on what is the product, number one. What is the real need that we're solving? What are the whys behind the questions that are being asked? What are the objections I can expect to happen most often, right? So again, it's like learning that. And then it's like, how are we then handling it, right? How are we responding to that? How are we presenting the technology versus what does the technology actually do and what does each feature do, right? How are we answering the objection versus what are the objections, right? And so it's like, get into it, right? You can't be a good leader. You can't actually drive change unless you foundationally know what the reality of what your people are dealing with is. And then I'd say the third thing is people, right? Ultimately, you're only going to go as far as your people. And so you have to establish that you are there to build trust and that you don't, it's not something that you expect to have right away, right? You expect to earn it and you expect to learn from them. And again, going into what I was kind of touching on, briefly, it's like, be vulnerable, right? I don't know everything, right? I do obviously have my experience that I'm sure ultimately that I'll be able to help you. But right now, I'm gonna have some dumb questions, right? And it's because you need to go through those bumps in the road in order to be able to drive some significant value. And if you start your people conversations off of a plane like that, I think you're setting yourself up for success, because ultimately you will be delivering value to them or else you're screwed anyways, right? So I think kind of starting at that foundation, and then obviously be a human being, right? So like, at the end of the day, like, get to know your people on a real level, get to know why they do what they do, why they are who they are, and then dive into, you know, how do they do their job, what they can improve, what they think the company should improve at, so on and so forth. So I think it's like, listen, dive in deep, go with the people, and then try to impact change. All the while, I think there's going to be micro moments where your experience can actually drive some inherent value and actually move the needle without like totally, needing to go to an extreme, right? So like, I'll give you an example. I've taken over organizations before where there's some simple blocking and tackling sales plays and tactics that just weren't being done, that like I don't need to know anything to know that you need to ask for a next meeting at the end of every call, right? I don't need to know anything about the product to know I need to give a really good upfront contract. I don't need to know anything about the product to know that when I do my discovery, if I'm not taking the answers they give me from discovery and tying those back into as I present the technology, that is going to be valuable, right? So that all comes from experience, right? So the net of it is you'll probably be able to drive value just pulling from that experience, but you got that experience from like actually living it and taking time and being there. So don't try to rush that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so many different strands I could pull on and go further down, but unfortunately we're coming to the end here. But before we do, if there's anywhere that the folks at home can maybe learn a little bit more about you or EverStage, now's the time to let them know.
Yeah, absolutely. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Mike Groeneveld, ton of letters, ton of E's in the last name, but if there's anything you want to talk about, I'm open book. I'm a really big believer on you get out what you put out, right? So if there's a scenario you want to talk through, I'm more than happy to do that. I do that with people. That's how I learn. And so I'm more than happy to. And then EverStage, we're the top rated commission automation platform on G2, on Trust Radius, on Gartner Peer Insights. And so you can find us pretty much anywhere. If you have any commission problems, we probably have a solution for you that'll be a really good fit. So that's where you can find us.